Welcome to Strange Encounters, where real people share their extraordinary experiences with the unknown. From strange lights in the sky to close encounters with beings not of this world, these are the stories that will leave you wondering what's out there. I'm your host, Emma Strange. Join me as we discover realms beyond our own. Let's begin. The UFO I was never meant to remember, a true encounter in Shropshire. I've been lurking on UFO forums for years, quietly reading other people's stories. But today I want to finally share my own. It's an experience that's haunted me for years, an encounter I feel I wasn't supposed to remember. Before I get to the main event, let me give you some context. I'm 44 years old, living in Staffordshire in the UK. I've always had a fascination with UFOs since I was a child. And I've always had an active imagination. I know that makes my story sound suspicious to some, but I want to be upfront about who I am. I'm open to all possibilities, even if that means my memory is flawed. But deep down, I believe this happened exactly as I remember it. Over the years, I've had a handful of strange experiences. As a small child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, I woke one night to see a hooded figure, like a faceless monk, sitting at the end of my bed. I was frozen in terror, hiding under the covers until I fell back asleep. Rationally, maybe it was just a dream. But I promised myself I'd never forget it. Years later, as a teenager, I woke up one night to the sound of heavy breathing and slow, deliberate footsteps pacing up and down the side of my bed. I lay completely still, too afraid to move, for what felt like half an hour or more. When it stopped, I stayed frozen until I drifted back to sleep. My family insisted it must have been a dream or sleepwalking. But I know what I heard. The third experience happened much later, when I was in my 30s. 2 friends and I decided to do some wild camping at Cannock Chase, a place known for strange phenomena, black-eyed children, ghosts, and UFO sightings. It was November. Cold. We brought only sleeping bags and a little beer. At around 11 p.m. we saw it, a glowing orange orb high among the trees, pulsing softly, maybe 200 or 300 meters away. It wasn't a torch. It wasn't a street lamp. And it reappeared twice more in different spots before vanishing. We were too caught up in the moment to film it. Even now, none of us can explain what we saw. All of that was just background. Now comes the encounter I've never been able to shake. This happened somewhere between 2016 and 2018. Back then, I was working as a social worker in Shropshire. It's a rural county with rolling fields, small towns, and a lot of farmland. I was driving between appointments one day, a clear, bright day in spring or late summer, somewhere between Bishop's Castle and Bridgnorth. And then I saw it. At about 1 o'clock to my right, above a tree line, was a hovering disc-shaped object. Dark in colour. Massive, at least the size of 2 passenger planes side by side. I lost sight of it as the trees blocked my view, but I was determined to get closer. Up ahead was a small right-hand junction. I took it, thinking it would bring me nearer. As I drove down the narrow country road, I saw a brick wall to my left. To my right, sloping fields. And then, in one of those fields, was the object. It was on the ground. Huge, maybe the size of 2 football pitches. Dark green, almost blending into the field itself. It wasn't a perfect disc. There were indentations or openings along its edge, 2 or 3, maybe more. The shape reminded me vaguely of an octagon, though I can't be sure. My memory of it is fuzzy, like looking through a dream. And then something strange happened. I remember thinking it was just farming equipment. Or maybe a hot air balloon. 2 completely different things, yet somehow in that moment I was convinced it was one or the other. So I just drove on. I didn't stop. I didn't take photos. I didn't turn back. I simply carried on, and I can't even remember where I went next. It's as if something told me, there's nothing to see here, move along. There was no missing time. No scars. No nightmares of abduction. Just a memory buried in my mind, suppressed for years. I never spoke of it to anyone, not even my wife, until 2 years ago. What triggered it? Of all things, a TV interview with Kurt Russell. He was talking about the Phoenix Lights UFO sighting, how he'd been the pilot who reported it, and how he himself had forgotten about it for years, until something triggered the memory again. When I heard that, it was like a switch flipped in my mind. Suddenly, the memory of my own sighting came flooding back. I told my wife. I told my friends. And since then, my interest in UFOs has reignited. But I'm left with questions. Do these things, whatever they are, have the power to make us forget we've seen them? Could people be encountering them every day, only to have the memories wiped or altered? Why would something like this land in a random farmer's field in Shropshire? And why was I allowed to see it, only to forget? I don't have the answers, but I know what I saw. And now at last I've spoken it out loud. The Ariel School UFO Encounter. In September of 1994, at a small school in rural Zimbabwe, more than 60 children claimed they witnessed something extraordinary, a craft that descended from the sky, and beings unlike anything they had ever seen before. What they described has haunted them for decades, and remains one of the most compelling alien encounter cases on record. This is the story of the Ariel School UFO Encounter. It was a bright morning on Friday, September 16, 1994. The Ariel School sat nestled in the quiet town of Ruwa, Zimbabwe, a rural farming community surrounded by open fields and scrubland. At around 10 o'clock, the teachers were inside for a staff meeting, leaving the children, ranging in age from about 6 to 12 years old, outside for their morning recess. The air was hot, the sun high. Most of the kids were gathered in small groups, playing in the dirt and grass. But out of nowhere, something unusual caught their attention. Several children noticed strange flashing lights in the sky. At first, they thought it might be an airplane, but this was different. Erratic, darting movements, too quick and too silent for anything conventional. As the object descended, the children began to realize they were looking at something far stranger. A shiny, silver, disc-shaped craft hovered above the trees at the edge of the school grounds. Some children described it as metallic and reflective, while others said it shimmered with a strange, glowing light. It landed, or nearly landed, just beyond the bushes. From the craft emerged small figures, no taller than the older students. They were described as thin, black-clad beings with unusually large, elongated heads and huge, almond-shaped eyes. The children's descriptions were remarkably consistent. Black skin-tight suits, thin, spindly bodies, huge, hypnotic eyes that seemed to pull them into a trance. Some children said there was only one being, others swore they saw 2 or even 3. But what every child agreed upon was the overwhelming sense of fear, and yet curiosity. Several students reported that when they locked eyes with the beings, they received telepathic messages. The messages were not spoken aloud, but came as sudden thoughts and feelings pressed into their minds. The theme of those messages was chilling. Warnings about the future of Earth, humanity's misuse of technology, a need to protect the environment before it was too late. One girl later explained that the beings showed her images of environmental destruction, forests burning, oceans dying, pollution choking the skies. Another said she felt an urgent message: you must take care of your planet. When recess ended, the children rushed inside, many of them panicked and in tears. Teachers quickly noticed something was wrong. More than 60 students, many of them still shaking, tried to explain what they had seen. At first, the staff thought it was simply a case of mass imagination or storytelling. But as they began to interview the children individually, something remarkable became clear. Their stories were consistent, despite being separated. Their descriptions matched almost perfectly. Their emotions were real. Many were visibly traumatized, their voices trembling. The event was so compelling that Cynthia Hind, a well-known UFO researcher in Africa, came to the school to investigate. She interviewed the children one by one, recording their accounts. The BBC and local Zimbabwean news also covered the story. Not long after, Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack, a Pulitzer Prize-winning professor, traveled to Zimbabwe to interview the students himself. Mack had spent years studying alien abduction cases, and he was stunned by what he found. The children were sincere, consistent, and visibly shaken. Matt concluded that they were not lying. Whatever they experienced, they believed it had really happened. To this day, the Ariel school encounter remains unexplained. The children, now grown adults, still remember what they saw. Many have been re-interviewed decades later, and their stories remain consistent, with no sign of fabrication. Skeptics argue it may have been mass hysteria or a case of suggestibility, but the number of witnesses, their young age, and the depth of their emotional responses make this case stand apart. If it was simply children making up stories, how did they all describe the same beings, the same messages, and the same craft with such precision? Over 60 children at the Ariel school in Zimbabwe say they saw a craft from another world and beings that delivered a warning for the future of humanity. Were they victims of group imagination, or chosen messengers for an urgent truth about our planet's fate? You decide. The Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter. On the night of August 21, 1955, a quiet farmhouse in rural Kentucky became the stage for one of the most terrifying alleged alien encounters in history. The Kelly-Hopkinsville incident remains one of the strangest cases on record, not just for the number of witnesses, but for the sheer intensity of the events that unfolded that night. The Sutton family lived in a modest farmhouse near the small towns of Kelly and Hopkinsville. On that summer evening, the household was unusually full, 11 people in total, including family and friends. As dusk settled, the group prepared for a quiet night. But around 7 o'clock, one of the guests, Billy Ray Taylor, stepped outside to fetch water from the well. What he saw in the sky left him stunned. According to Billy Ray, a glowing object streaked across the horizon before descending into a wooded area near the farmhouse. At first, the family laughed off his claim, thinking he was joking or mistaken. But within the hour, the laughter turned to horror. The family's dog began barking furiously, then retreated under the house, refusing to come out. Moments later, strange noises echoed from the darkness outside. The men grabbed rifles, uneasy but ready. Then they saw it. A small creature, glowing faintly in the moonlight, emerged from the trees. It was about 3 feet tall, with a large, round head, oversized ears, glowing yellow eyes, and long, spindly arms that nearly touched the ground. Its movements were jerky and unnatural. When the men fired their guns, the bullets seemed to have little effect. The creature flipped and tumbled, then scurried away into the shadows. But the nightmare was only beginning. More figures appeared, perhaps a dozen of them, surrounding the farmhouse. The beings approached the windows, peered inside, and seemed to toy with the terrified family. The witnesses later described their movements as otherworldly, almost floating, as if gravity had little hold on them. For nearly 4 hours, the family fought back. They fired repeatedly, the sound of gunshots echoing through the Kentucky night. Each time they thought they had hit one of the beings, it would simply fall and then glide away unharmed. At one point, one of the creatures reached down from the roof with a claw-like hand, terrifying the children inside. Finally, after what felt like an endless siege, the activity ceased. Exhausted and terrified, the family piled into their cars and drove straight to the Hopkinsville police station. When they arrived, they were pale, shaken, and nearly incoherent. The police took them seriously, so seriously that they sent officers back to the farmhouse immediately. By the time authorities arrived, the creatures were gone. But evidence remained: strange scratches, broken windows, and shotgun shells littered around the property. Officers interviewed all 11 witnesses separately, and their accounts matched with eerie consistency. The story quickly spread, making headlines across the country. Skeptics claimed it was nothing more than overactive imaginations, or perhaps monkeys that had escaped from a traveling circus. Others blamed owls, saying their glowing eyes might have frightened the family. But those who were there insisted it was something else, something far stranger. The Kelly-Hopkinsville Encounter remains one of the most widely cited cases in UFO lore, partly because of the sheer number of witnesses. 11 people, including children, all told the same story. Their home was attacked by beings not of this world. Were the Suttons simply victims of fear and imagination, or did they endure one of the most harrowing close encounters in history? The Pascagoula Abduction. On the night of October 11, 1973, 2 men went fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi. What happened to them next would become one of the most famous and chilling alien abduction cases ever recorded. This is the story of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker and the night that changed their lives forever. Charles Hickson, age 42, was a hardworking shipyard foreman. His friend Calvin Parker, just 19, was new to the job and eager to prove himself. That evening, the two decided to relax with a little fishing after work. As they cast their lines into the dark waters, the quiet night was suddenly interrupted. A strange buzzing sound filled the air, followed by a bright blue light. The men looked up in shock as a massive, oval-shaped craft descended, glowing against the night sky. It hovered silently just a few feet above the ground. Before the two could react, a hatch opened, and 3 beings floated out. The creatures were unlike anything the men had ever seen. They were humanoid, about 5 feet tall, with grey, wrinkled skin like that of an elephant. Their heads were shaped oddly, with carrot-like protrusions where ears and noses should have been, and claw-like hands that looked sharp and metallic. The beings moved without walking, gliding across the ground until they reached the 2 men. Calvin froze in terror while Charles tried to keep calm. Suddenly, both men felt paralyzed, unable to move as the beings grabbed them. They were floated into the craft, where bright, blinding lights surrounded them. Charles later described being examined by a strange, robotic eye that scanned his body from head to toe. He felt no pain, but an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Calvin, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with fear, certain they would not survive. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The men found themselves back on the riverbank, the glowing craft vanishing into the night sky. Shaken and terrified, they sat in silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Finally, they decided to report the encounter to the local sheriff's office. When questioned, both men stuck to their story, even when left alone in a room secretly fitted with a recorder. Authorities expected them to break down or admit it was a hoax, but instead, the hidden recording captured the men whispering in fear, praying, and trying to make sense of their experience. Their terror was real. News of the Pascagoula abduction spread quickly, drawing reporters, UFO investigators, and skeptics alike. Charles and Calvin gave multiple interviews, though Calvin in particular avoided the spotlight, traumatized by the experience. Years later, he would speak out again, still haunted by what happened on that riverbank. Skeptics have suggested the men were hallucinating or fabricating the story. But to this day, no evidence has ever disproven their claims. The fact that both men passed lie detector tests and that their fear was captured on tape makes the Pascagoula case one of the most compelling abduction stories ever told. 2 ordinary men went fishing on a quiet Mississippi evening and instead returned with a story of alien beings, paralysis, and abduction aboard a craft not of this earth. Were Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker truly taken by something beyond our understanding, or was it an elaborate illusion of the mind? You decide. The Falcon Lake UFO Encounter. On May 20, 1967, in the quiet wilderness of Manitoba, Canada, an ordinary man experienced an encounter so strange and terrifying that it left him physically scarred for life. This case has come to be known as the Falcon Lake Incident, and it is considered one of the most well-documented UFO encounters in history. The man at the center of this story was Stefan Michalak, a 51-year-old industrial mechanic and amateur geologist. He often traveled to the wilderness around Falcon Lake to prospect for precious metals, hoping to strike it rich. That spring morning, Michalak packed his tools and set off into the forest. The day started as any other. The sun was shining, the air crisp, and the wilderness around him was alive with the sound of birds and the rustle of pine trees. But then, something extraordinary shattered the stillness. As Michalak worked near a rocky outcrop, he heard a strange commotion above him. Looking up, he saw 2 glowing objects in the sky. At first, he thought they were experimental aircraft from a nearby military base. The craft moved silently, like glowing ovals in the sky. One of them hovered above, then suddenly ascended and disappeared. The other descended, landing on a flat section of rock just a short distance away. Stefan watched in awe. The craft was metallic, disc-shaped, and about 35 feet across. Its surface shimmered like polished steel, reflecting the bright sunlight. It emitted a sulfur-like smell, sharp and chemical, unlike anything he had experienced before. Gathering his courage, Stefan cautiously approached. The craft had no obvious doors or seams, but as he circled it, he discovered an opening, like a hatch. Inside, he saw beams of light and what looked like panels of flashing colors, almost like a control board. Strange voices echoed from within, though he could not understand them. Stefan called out, offering help in English, Polish, and even German, hoping someone inside might respond. But there was no reply, only the strange, mechanical hum of the craft. Suddenly, the hatch closed. Stefan reached out and touched the craft's surface. It was so hot it burned his gloves instantly. As he stumbled back, the craft rotated. A panel on its side opened and a blast of hot gas shot out directly at him. The force knocked him to the ground, his shirt bursting into flames. When he ripped it off, he saw a grid-like pattern of burns seared into his chest and stomach, marks that would remain for the rest of his life. The craft then lifted silently into the air, hovering for a moment before streaking off into the sky at impassable speed. In shock and pain, Stefan stumbled back through the forest, clutching his burns. He eventually made it back to his hotel room where he collapsed. Doctors who examined him later confirmed the strange grid-shaped burn pattern. Over time, his health began to deteriorate. He suffered from headaches, nausea, weight loss, and even blackouts. Soil samples taken from the site were found to be radioactive, and to this day, the landing site near Falcon Lake has unusual radiation readings. What makes this case especially powerful is that Stefan Michalak was not a man seeking fame. He was practical, down-to-earth, and reluctant to speak publicly. He never changed his story, and his injuries were real, verified by doctors and investigators alike. The Canadian government even investigated the case, with both the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the US Air Force becoming involved. Despite thorough research, no official explanation was ever given. Skeptics have tried to argue it was a hoax or a misidentified military aircraft, but none of those theories explain the burns, the radiation, or the sheer terror Stefan endured. The Falcon Lake incident remains Canada's most famous UFO encounter, not because of flashy claims, but because of the physical evidence burned into the skin of an ordinary man who came face to face with something extraordinary. Was Stefan Michalak simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did he stumble upon undeniable proof that we are not alone? And that's the end of another episode of Strange Encounters. I'm Emma Strange, and it's been a real pleasure taking you along on today's journey through stories that make us question what we know, and what we think we know. Whether it's the unexplained, the mysterious, or the downright bizarre, these encounters remind us that the world is far bigger, stranger, and more fascinating than we sometimes realize. Thank you for listening, thank you for being curious, and thank you for allowing me to share these stories with you. I hope you'll carry a little bit of wonder with you, and maybe even keep an eye out for the strange and unexpected in your own life. From the bottom of my heart, I appreciate you joining me on this adventure, and I can't wait to share the next story with you. Until then, keep your mind open, your imagination alive, and remember, you never know what might be lurking just beyond the edge of the ordinary. This has been Strange Encounters with me, Emma Strange. Until next time.